Good morning and welcome. We're glad that you're here for our study. We are looking at the book of Jonah. This is our second study, Jonah chapter 1, verses 10 to 17, man overboard. Do the strangers you encounter each day know that you are a Christian? And by strangers, I mean the folks at the gas station who are filling up their tanks at the same time you're filling up yours. Or the same folks who are in the checkout line at a store that you're standing in. Or the same folks that you pass on a hiking trail. Or the ones that are in the same waiting room at the doctor's office. Unless you know each other, they probably don't know that you're a Christian. And why would they? And well, to be honest, you probably don't know anything about them either. What you think about each other might depend on your past encounters with someone that they might in some way remind you of, and who you remind them of. And yes, while we don't like to admit it, we tend to categorize people, not in a racial way, although some do, but if a person has a British accent that was well educated and able to teach you something you wanted to know, you'd probably tend to think about other people with that same accent in that same positive, intelligent kind of way. They may not be, but that's the assumption you would make. And if a person who looked wealthy treated you with contempt, you'd tend to think of other people that are wealthy in the same way. And those perceptions aren't limited to our own personal experience, but are also influenced by what others have told you about a particular sort of person. And there are a lot of voices in this world about the strangers around you. Let me explain this social dynamic with a story from the Lewis and Clark famous expedition to the Pacific Northwest. In 1804, it almost came to an untimely and deadly end. Half-starved and almost frozen, the men staggered out of Idaho's snowy Bitterroot Mountains to the camp of the Nez Perce Indians. A chief named Twisted Hair had to decide what to do with the weak but wealthy strangers that suddenly appeared in their midst. According to the tribe's oral tradition, some of the Nez Perce proposed killing the pale-skinned men and confiscating their boxes of manufactured goods and weapons. The expedition's rifles and ammunition alone would have instantly made the Nez Perce the region's richest and most powerful nation. But one of the women came to the aid to the men of the expedition. As a young girl, she had been captured by an enemy tribe on the plains, who in turn sold her to another tribe. Eventually, she was befriended and treated kindly by some fair-skinned people in Canada before escaping and making her way back to her own people. They called her Watakuwais, and I probably mispronounced that, but it meant returned from a faraway country. And for years, she told them stories about the fair-skinned people who lived toward the rising sun. She was an older woman when the explorers arrived in their camp. And when she learned about the plans to kill the men, she intervened, saying, "These are the people who helped me. Don't hurt them." And they listened. I'm glad that this encounter, based on her assumptions about these strangers, turned out well. It could likely have gone a different direction depending on who the people were. Like the sailors surrounding Jonah, the strangers in your life might well be prone to getting religion in the midst of a crisis. Now, why would I make that kind of an assumption? Because according to the Pew Research Center, Christianity, including both Catholic and Protestant, continues to decline at a rapid pace, losing about 12 percentage points every 2 years, according to their ongoing survey of roughly 35,000 people. The last data they released from this survey was for 2018 and 2019. That means across the nation, Christianity has declined over those 2 years from 77% of the population to 65%. But the good news is that only about 2% said that they were agnostic and only about 4% atheistic. which showed very little increase. However, 17% said that they were nothing in particular. These nunners, as they are starting to be called, it was the only group that really is increasing. But that still means that the majority of the strangers around you are probably religious and likely Christian at some level. But from my experience, it usually takes a crisis for that faith to rise to the surface of those who are not actively involved in a church. At least 50% of our population say they are involved, but only about 20% attend a service on a regular basis, which has dropped even further and more drastically during the restrictions related to COVID-19. But for some other reasons, and we expect that to come back as restrictions are released. It doesn't matter what sort of crisis a person encounters. It might be an identity crisis, it might be a basic needs crisis, it might be a marriage crisis, it might be an addiction crisis, or a parenting crisis, or a social justice crisis. A crisis is a time of intense difficulty, trouble, and danger, physically, mentally, or socially, or spiritually. A crisis can also be when a person is facing an important, potentially life-altering or threatening decision. As I said, it is usually when a person is facing a crisis that they turn to the Lord for help. And quite often, they only turn to Him after having tried everything they could do to resolve the crisis on their own strength and have finally failed. It is also highly likely that some of these strangers in your life are in a crisis and are looking for help from above, but you'd never know it because you don't know them and they don't know you. The sailors didn't know who to blame for their crisis, only that it was not a natural storm that they were in, and so they felt that one of them must have upset some god somewhere. As we learned last week, seeking divine direction by casting lots, the sailors discovered that Jonah was to blame for their situation. I think it is fair to say that the sailors knew nothing about Jonah's faith in the Lord until he made his confession. They were strangers. But they did assume that he was religious, that just like they were, and so he should be able to get up and call on his God for help, just as they were calling on their gods for help. In Jonah's confession, he not only revealed his identity, but how it was deeply rooted in a relationship with God, who just happened to be the one who created the land and the sea, and how Jonah was trying to escape from his presence. The Hebrew term translated presence literally means before the face of, and it can be understood in a variety of different ways depending on the context in which it is used. As I said last week, I don't believe that Jonah felt that he could actually escape God's reach, but he did believe that he could escape from doing what God asked him to do by running in the opposite direction. Jonah's crisis was, which way do I go? He knew what God wanted him to do and which way God wanted him to go, but he did not want to go that way and didn't want to do what God had asked him to do in proclaiming the good news to the people of Nineveh. So he faced an obedience crisis. When the sailors heard Jonah's well of a tale, they asked him out of disbelief, "How could you do that?" Their question implied that they believed what Jonah said about God. They believed it was really true. The raging storm was evidence enough for them that Jonah's God was who Jonah had told them to be, that he had created and was able to control the elements around them. And what they now believed about God frightened them. And because of this fear, they were willing to do anything and everything to appease Jonah's God. There was something refreshing about the obedience of someone who has recently gone through a foxhole conversion. They are convinced that God had intervened and saved their lives, not just eternally speaking, but in a real world sort of way. Some of those who go through such an experience stick with their newfound faith. Others fall away from it entirely. Sort of like Jesus' parable about the seed that is planted in different kinds of soil. The sailor's seed was planted in the fertile soil of fear. It was King Solomon who said that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but it was the strangers from whom the Assyrians used to colonize Israel after they had conquered it and taken the people of Israel captive, who became afraid of the Lord because they were facing a crisis. Lions were among them, which were killing some of them. You can read the story in 2 Kings 17:25. They felt that this was happening because they didn't know the God of the land that they were trying to occupy. And they were afraid of what else this God might do to them if they didn't get to know him. So they sent word asking that a priest be returned from captivity to teach them to properly fear the Lord, which was done. By fear, they meant how to show respectful obedience, which they did once this priest arrived and taught them how. But instead of turning away from their old gods, they just simply wanted to add obeying the God of Israel to their list of religious things to do to keep all of the gods happy. As a result, they didn't end up truly fearing the Lord. That is, they didn't obey and worship him exclusively. They did not trust him alone to take care of them. Jesus once spoke about how people are motivated by fear, and that we usually end up doing what people tell us to do whenever they threaten to kill us if we don't do as they say. Jesus said that instead of fearing such people, we need to fear the one who can not only kill the body, but cast the soul into hell. That is the one, Jesus said, we should fear. The sailors were in self-preservation mode. What were they to do with this runaway prophet that would result in pleasing his God and thereby calm the sea? Jonah gave them the answer, but they didn't like it. The answer was to throw Jonah into the sea, but they didn't want to kill Jonah, and doing so would have gone against what they thought was right. They didn't think that he deserved death. And so they couldn't trust God to do what is right because they didn't have that sort of faith. So they took matters into their own hands, literally. They tried again to save themselves and Jonah by rowing the boat to shore. But their efforts only made things worse. The storm grew stronger. They finally gave up and pleaded for mercy, asking God to spare them, and not only to hold Jonah's innocent blood against them, but they were fearful enough by this point to do what they were told by Jonah would please the Lord. When they threw Jonah into the sea, the storm stopped. This calming of the storm, this deliverance, seemed to induce an even greater fear in these sailors than they had felt during the storm. A fear of awe and wonder and respect. They offered sacrifices to God and made vows to him. We don't know the sort of vows that they made, but it implies that they were willing to make some pretty strong commitments to honoring and obeying Jonah's God. And they would probably tell this story about how this God had saved them. And they might even, like return from faraway country, connect with and treat well those they encountered who follow the God of Jonah. We don't know the rest of their story, but we do know the rest of Jonah's story. He became a sign that Jesus said would be the only sign that the people of Nazareth would ever see, a sign that foreshadowed Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. The people of Nazareth grew up with Jesus, and they thought of him, well, as Mary's boy. They had heard that Jesus was going around doing miracles over all the region, and they wanted Jesus to come to their town and perform miracles for them so that they could accept his claims. But the Gospels record that Jesus could do no signs there because of their lack of faith. It's interesting that in the other places where Jesus was performing miracles, those people came to him because they were facing a crisis, and they believed that Jesus could help them, that Jesus could even do the impossible to help them, and he did. Jesus told the people of Nazareth that the only sign that they would see is the sign of Jonah, which is miracle enough to save them. Whether we realize it or not, we all face a life and death crisis in regard to our life beyond the grave, just as those in Nazareth did. Those who come to accept this truth can either face it on their own or with whatever religious system they think will address it. But there is only one God who's creator of heaven and earth, only one God who sent his Son to save not only us, but the entire world. We can learn to fear him and accept his offer of help, to trust him, or we can go our own way. We can even offer to trust him to do something that we don't know what is right, to toss a person overboard. Well, and to be quite honest, like Jonah, we are not so innocent. We have sinned. The penalty of death is death for sin, according to Paul in his letter to the Romans. That means, like Jonah, each of us need to be thrown overboard into the sea of baptism. The old rebellious person needs to die in the watery grave, and the new person can rise up with Christ and be filled with the Spirit, as Paul taught in Romans, the 6th chapter. It is only then, when we have been transformed by God's grace, that we can faithfully follow his call to go into the world, sharing the good news of his love for the world and his offer of redemption. God really is longing to do good. He loves the world, and he is wanting to save it, and he is wanting to use you in that process. I don't know what crisis people around you are facing, but they need God to help them through it. And you are someone who've already experienced his help, his deliverance, his transformation. And he wants to use you to share that message of, yes, this God is real, and he can transform lives. You just need to trust him. Would you join me in prayer? Lord, help us to fear you and you alone. We want to trust you fully and wholly, giving our lives to you alone. We accept your judgment that we deserve death, and we rejoice that your Son has taken our place on the cross, has died for us, and has risen again, that we might not have to die in that same way, but that we can be united with him in his death, so that we might be united with him in his resurrection. We put our trust in you alone. We trust you for your amazing grace. Jesus, it's in your name that we come to you looking for your deliverance, asking you to continue to use us to spread your good news. Amen.